Our next speaker, of course, is another well-known Jain scholar, Uwe Kornström from the University of Lund, who's going to present a paper on Jain and Buddhist critique of Samkhya philosophy.
Dear Professor Jain, dear friends and colleagues, my first encounter with Professor Jain was 24 years ago. I had just finished my PhD, and soon after, fortune had it that Professor Jain was invited to Lund University in Sweden, and that the task had fallen on me to have Professor Jain as my house guest. The meeting with Professor Jain would turn out to be most valuable for my future personal and academic career. During Professor Jain's visit, my life changed dramatically, and I soon discovered that I had a hermit in the house. Every morning I would put a cup of tea in front of the bedroom door, knowing that he spent his first hour of the day reading the Mahabharata, and every evening my skills in vegetarian cooking were put to the test. I was also surprised to find an unusual element in the diet of my hermit guest, the drinking of beer. This, I was told, was on the doctor's order, and only one beer was allowed. Our conversations during dinner taught me a lot about Jainism, but as a true Shishya, I did not dare to ask if we could read the Jain text that I proposed in our correspondence. Instead, I waited for the right moment. And I waited and waited, and finally the time had come. One day, Professor Jain asked me if I would like to study the Yoga Shastra of Hemachandra. And after that, this text followed us on a tour to Stockholm and Uppsala and to Professor Asko Parpola in Helsinki. After our tour, Professor Jain left for Berkeley and returned to Sweden years later for a conference in his honor. Since then, I've spent several research visits in Berkeley and under Professor Jain's kind auspices. As a scholar and true friend, Professor Jain has meant a lot to me in my life. It is therefore with the greatest pleasure that I partake in this symposium in honor of his 90th birthday. Now, allow me to finally come to the topic of my small lecture on Jain and Buddhist critique of Samkhya philosophy. On 3 separate occasions, Karna fought against and was defeated by Gatotkacha, the son of Bhimasena and the forest demoness Hidimba. Then taking up the secret javelin that Indra had awarded him to kill his enemies, he hurled it at Gatotkacha. Gatotkacha transformed into a serpent, whereupon the javelin transformed into an eagle. Gatotkacha then transformed into a mouse, whereupon the javelin transformed into an owl. Finally, when Gatotkacha transformed into fire, the javelin transformed into water. Every time Gatotkacha transformed, the weapon continued to pursue him. No matter what form he assumed, the javelin transformed into a form that could defeat him until he was finally killed. In this garbled version of the duel between Karna and Gatotkacha on the 14th and 15th day of the great battle in the Mahabharata, the Madhyamaka philosopher Bhagavad cautions his imagined Samkhya opponent that regardless of how many attempts he may make to modify the tenets of his system, Bhagavad-vika's relentless exposure of each modification's fallacy would eventually lead to entire defeat. Just as Karna's javelin overtook and ultimately destroyed Gatotkacha, Bhagavad-vika's logical arguments would overtake and ultimately destroy his opponent's point of view, regardless of the latter's various attempts to alter his doctrinal stance. One of the central questions in the 6th to 8th century debate between Buddhists like Bhagavad-vika and Jain philosophers on the one side and Samkhya on the other involved the Samkhya understanding of how and where knowledge arises and how the self is able to experience knowledge without undergoing change. Because of the paucity of sources that directly pertain to this period in the history of Samkhya philosophy, the details of the involved arguments remain largely unknown, at least in terms of the Samkhya side. With the possible exception of the Yuktidipika, there exists not a single Samkhya treatise that addresses either the Buddhist or the Jain critique. Despite this fact, there remains a possible way by which to examine the various arguments and counter-arguments that might have been employed in this debate, if indeed there was one. The study of Jain and Buddhist doxographical texts. These texts provide us with a series of hypothetical, but in all probability historically anchored debates. The historical background of these debates involved a shift in Samkhya philosophy, the seeds of which can be found in proto-Samkhya texts, wherein there is discussion about whether the self should be defined as a knower, whether pure consciousness constitutes the self's intrinsic nature, and so forth. With the composition of the Samkhya Karika and the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, however, an insurmountable philosophical chasm was established in Samkhya philosophy between a non-active self or consciousness and active non-conscious primordial matter. In these works, the self is viewed as a knower, and the process by which the self knows is said to ultimately belong to the material faculty of knowledge. Although the self per se is considered to be outside the process of knowledge, it nonetheless remains connected to it in a fundamentally interdependent way. Other schools of thought readily detected the contradictions involved in this radically dualistic stance, and thus classical Samkhya philosophy was challenged by a diversity of critics, including those representing the Buddhist and Jain traditions. The Madhyamaka Hridaya Karika and Tarkajvala ascribed to the Samkhya tradition two different theories concerning the process of knowledge. More precisely, Samkhya philosophy, as described by Bhavaviveka, teaches that the process of acquiring knowledge takes place in one way for those that exist in the cycle of birth and death, and another way for those that exist in the liberated state. According to the first of these epistemological theories, the senses apprehend a given object by coming into mutual conformity with it, after which it is apprehended by the mind. Then the object is ascertained and fully comprehended by the intellect or faculty of knowledge, which grabs its image. The self, although non-active and contentless, is somehow in proximity of and thus connected to the faculty of knowledge. Because of this, the self comes to understand the object by following the activity of the faculty of knowledge. In this way, the cognitive process of the self, abhinyavritti, becomes non-different from that of the faculty of knowledge, buddhivritti. The second theory conforms to the first theory up to the point where it is stated that the object of knowledge is ascertained and fully comprehended by the faculty of knowledge. It diverges, however, in stating that when the mind is elevated to the point where it becomes dominated by sattva guna, the self acquires knowledge of the object by way of imitating through reflection, pratibimba, the operations of the faculty of the intellect. According to Bhavaviveka, the theory that the cognitive process of the self becomes non-different from that of the Buddhi undermines the notion of an independent or contentless self or consciousness that is intrinsically different from the Buddhi. It is possible to establish non-difference between separate substances by way of their own distinctions, he says, but not between a substance, that is the Buddhi, and a metaphorical entity, that is Purusha. As to the theory that the self experiences knowledge by imitating the operations of the intellect via reflection, this is criticized by Bhavaviveka as follows. Even if the Samkhyas are correct in concluding that the self remains unchanged by the process of reflection, their own argument nonetheless demands that it would have to be involved as a facilitating cause, Pakali, a notion that contradicts the Samkhya view that the self is fundamentally outside the realm of cause and effect. Moreover, the notion that the imitation involves a process of transformation is considered to be contradictory as well, despite the Samkhya claim that it brings about no real change to the self. If the Purusha is said to undergo a transformation, it cannot simultaneously be said to possess an intrinsic nature. Thus, by introducing the idea of transformation, the Samkhyas contradict their own notion of a permanent, uncaused and omnipresent self. Bhavaviveka concludes that the consciousness of the self that is distinct from that which is called understanding cannot possibly exist. Moreover, he continues, since the self or consciousness is said to be devoid of activity, it cannot possibly be a knower. In stark contrast to Bhava-viveka, Haribhadrasuri's Jain critique of Samkhya rests upon his belief in the fundamental existence of the self, although he differs from Samkhya with regard to how that self should be characterized. In the Yoga Bindu, Haribhadrasuri presents a hypothetical debate between the Jain and Samkhya philosophies, beginning with a critique of the Samkhya notion that the self knows an object only after the Buddhi has ascertained it. In contrast, Haribhadrasuri maintains that consciousness is identical to knowledge. Thus, at the time of liberation, when the pure self is no longer covered and or conditioned by veiling factors, it nonetheless remains capable of directly perceiving and thus knowing the subject without the medium of the material mind and senses. In retribution, the Samkhyas are said to state that in their view, consciousness is not at all identical with knowledge. Thus, at the time of liberation, when the self is in a state of separation from matter, no knowledge can exist on its part. Knowledge, according to Samkhya, belongs to Buddhi, which in turn is a product of primordial matter. Haribhadrasuri then returns to the initial critique concerning the locus and process of knowledge, and asks what it means to say that the self comprehends the object only after the Buddhi has apprehended it. The following two quotations, the first ascribed to Vindhyavasin and the second to Asuri, constitute the Samkhya response to this concern. By means of sheer proximity, the self, the essence of which is unchanging consciousness, makes the mind, which is devoid of consciousness, a reflection of itself, just as an adjunct, for example a flower, makes a crystal a reflection of itself. Furthermore, it is said by Asuri and others that the highest pleasure of the self arises when the intellect has undergone such a change whereby it has become separated from the self and whereby the self is reflected in the Buddhi, just like the appearance of the reflection of the moon in clear water. While these two quotations do not directly answer the question posed by Haribhadrasuri, they do outline the prerequisites that are necessary for the Buddhi to acquire knowledge, that is, Purusha or consciousness being reflected in Buddhi and Buddhi being transformed. In the state of liberation, Samkhya goes on to say, the object is correctly apprehended by the Buddhi because of a transformation that allows consciousness to be fully reflected within it. When an opaque stone has transformed to crystal, it is then able to fully reflect the color imposed by the proximity of a substance. In countering this explanation, Haribhadrasuri maintains that the self is fully reflected in the Buddhi, not through a transformation of Buddhi, but through a transformation of the self-consciousness. The Jain share with the classic Samkhya the notion of an individual self, adding that this individual self is transformative as well. Thus, they did not oppose this feature of Samkhya's explanation of the process of knowledge. Moreover, whereas both Buddhists and Samkhyas believed that the self's knowledge was dependent on the proximity of an object, the Jains maintain instead that having knowledge was one among the self's intrinsic qualities. In the Shastravarta Samashaya and its allied auto-commentary, the Dikprada, the Samkhya argues that it is possible for the self to experience an object without being in connection with it. In the liberated state, the self's enjoyment is not factually an enjoyment of the body, but rather arises as a reflection, as explained by the sages of yore, individuals such as Vindhyavasin and Asuri. After quoting these two sansas, Haribhadrasuri responds by pointing to the Samkhya's notion of the non-material and intrinsic nature of the self. The argument that the reflection of the self appears in the Buddhi is incompatible with the view that the self is non-material. Furthermore, since it would have too many illogical implications, the liberated self can never enjoy an object reflected in the Buddhi. This paper has focused on the period between the 6th and 8th century AD, and has involved the study of 3 doxographical texts stemming from that time. The text in question confirmed that one of the prime areas of controversy between Samkhya philosophers on the one side and Jain and Buddhist philosophers on the other involved the Samkhya understanding of how and where knowledge arises, and how the self is able to experience knowledge without undergoing change. In so doing, they document, among other things, a number of attempts to explain how the process of knowledge can occur exclusively in the intellect, which is said to be devoid of consciousness, and how the self is able to partake of that knowledge without deviating from its intrinsic nature. The controversy thus dealt with epistemological as well as ontological problems. This focus shifted from the 9th century onwards, most notably among Jain philosophers who borrowed arguments from the Buddhists in order to criticize Samkhya theories of causality. Many of the arguments directed to a Samkhya philosophy by Jain thinkers from the 9th century onwards were borrowed from Buddhism, notably the tattva-sangraha by Shantarakshita. The process, as described by Phyllis Granoff, went something like this. The Jain authors allowed one party in error, that is the Buddhist, to refute another party in error, that is the Sankhyas. Over the course of time, all reference to Buddhism were dropped, and the same arguments were presented as if they had been Jain arguments all along. Phyllis Granoff had referred to this period, characterized by the influence of Buddhist arguments and the focus on theories of causality, as the time in which Jain arguments against Samkhya philosophy were standardized. Our investigation of the 6th chapter of the Bhava Viveka's Madhyamaka Hridaya-karika and Tarka-dvala indicates that during the 6th century AD, the Samkhya tradition included schools or thinkers whose epistemology combined 2 previously established theories related to the process of knowledge, most likely in an attempt to counteract external criticism. One theory described the process of knowledge from the perspective of psychic existence, and the other described it from the perspective of liberation. Both theories presupposed the Sakara Jnanavada, which Samkhya shared with the Madhyamaka tradition, and which held that the mental operations of the intellect consisted of an image imprinted with the form of the external object. The first of these theories is found in the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, attributed to Panchashika, and in the Yukti Dipika, ascribed to Varshyagandha. The second has been generally associated with Vajrapati Mishra. Our findings, however, appear to indicate that this second theory was formulated several centuries earlier, since it is described first in Bhava Viveka's Madhyamaka Hridaya-karika, and later in Shantarakshita's tattva-sangraha and Kamalashila's tattva-sangraha. Yoga Vidya Shastravata Samachaya of Hariparasuri document a different version of the Pratibhimbhavada, according to which the self or Purusha is reflected in the Buddhi and not vice versa. Such a theory appears also in the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, the Yukti Dipika, and in fragments attributed by various Jain authors, including Hariparasuri, to either Vindhyavasin or the mythical Asuri. It is therefore reasonable to assume that Vindhyavasin formulated the earliest known version of the doctrine of reflection within the classical Samkhya tradition in order to defend the position that the self retains its unchanging status while simultaneously experiencing knowledge. According to Gerald Larson and others, Vindhyavasin's philosophy is closely related to Patanjala Yoga Shastra, the Yoga Sutra, and the Yoga Sutra Bhashya. And thus it may be that Vindhyavasin and Vyasa are one and the same person. If true, that the theory of reflection advocated by Vindhyavasin likely competed with the theory of knowledge of the old Samkhya school of Varshyagandha Shashti Tantra, and with the theory of knowledge of Ishvara Krishna, who was familiar with Vindhyavasin, but who in his Samkhya Karika did not markedly deviate from the philosophy of the Shashti Tantra. Over the course of time, the theory of the old Samkhya school was gradually replaced by different versions of the Pratibhimbhavada, most notably those documented by Bhava Viveka, Shantarakshita, Hariparasuri, and later advocated by Vachaspati Mishra and Vijnana Bhikshu. Now we come to the end. Thus, Bhavavekas and Hadarbarasuri's toxicographical accounts of Samkhya philosophy, despite their apologetic character, seems to provide us with unique information about the Samkhya tradition. It also tells us how they defended themselves against challenges posed by various grammatical systems and how they positioned themselves in relation to an opponent. Thank you.